everyone, my name is Tamás Maráci. I work for Danube Institute, and today I have a guest from Sweden, actually from America, but he's grown up in Sweden. Benedict Beckeld, a Swedish-American author and philosopher, and the topic of this conversation today is the decline of Western civilization. And one notion and one reason for that is oikophobia. It's a notion which was invented by Roger Scruton, but my guest used it in his book, and I'm wondering what it means and was the meaning and importance in today politics and our today everyday life. So, Benedict, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oikophobia means that we are hating our own culture. Why do we hate? And as Westerners, our culture.
We hate our own culture because it's actually an ingrained part, unfortunately, of what it means to be Western. And this is an important point because a lot of people think that this is something brand new and something modern that has maybe only existed since World War II or since the 1960s or something like that. But in fact, oikophobia, Western self-hate, is a recurring Western phenomenon that has been going on, that has been coming back ever since antiquity, ever since ancient Greece. Now, it was somewhat less extreme in those days. Every time it comes back, it's a little more extreme than before, but it's something that is a part of how Western societies develop. Is an important point that I've made. And so the reason why it happens, very briefly, is basically because once a Western society has developed not just wealth and security, other societies, non-Western societies, also sometimes develop wealth and security, but Western societies also have developed typically a sense of egalitarianism, democracy, maybe not full-fledged democracy, but something approaching democracy, and an open intellectual space where intellectuals can converse with each other and exchange ideas without the fear of the government or the church or anything like that. And once those circumstances are in place, oikophobia begins to appear because we no longer have an external enemy against which to fight. And so every human being or human beings in general require an adversary, an enemy of some kind. And so the new enemy becomes other people in one's own society. And so one begins to hate one's own society in an effort to raise oneself personally above the society. And so we see traces of this already in ancient Athens in the late 5th century, early 4th century BC. And then we see it in Rome, we see it in France in the Enlightenment era. We see it starts in late Victorian era in England and so on. Yeah.
At this point, can you just say details about this? You mentioned the ancient times, the Middle Age and the Enlightenment in France. Yeah. Can you just give details? What do you mean oikophobia appeared in Rome and Athens and Paris, for example?
Yeah, so what that means is that, again, it doesn't always look exactly the same. There are some differences, of course, from civilization to civilization. But so to give you an example, in late 5th century BC and early 4th century BC Athens, the notion of relativism develops. So people earlier in the society, they think that, okay, we're the best, and of course what we believe is correct and everybody else is wrong. The philosophical idea of relativism develops in ancient Greece, where they say, okay, well, it's not necessarily what we believe isn't necessarily what's right, it's just what we believe. Other people have just as much of a right to their truths. And so once you get this idea, that leads to a downgrading of Greek culture and to an uplifting of foreign cultures. And so, for example, there is Greeks begin to, certain intellectuals among the Greeks begin to imitate foreign manners, imitate Persian or Lydian manners at the expense of Greek customs. And they start to call themselves citizens of the world. I'm not a Greek citizen, I'm a citizen of the world. And so they downgrade their own culture. This is the kind of phenomenon we recognize in modern times as well. It's even more extreme now. But once we understand why it happens, then we can also understand why it happens today. You mentioned France, right? In the Enlightenment, we have people like Rousseau or Condorcet or Voltaire. They write things that sound sometimes almost exactly the same as what you might expect, what you might hear from a modern-day leftist. When they praise native peoples from faraway civilizations, and they downgrade French culture. And they talk about the nobility of exotic tribes, the beauty of foreign tribes of which they know nothing, same as modern oikophobes today. They praise other cultures. They don't know anything about the other cultures usually, but they praise them. And this we see in France as well, because the same socio-historical circumstances have been reached at that time in France as was reached in ancient Greece, in Rome, and so on.
So it's a pattern of mentality, as you say, but I understand the rules now. Yeah. But can you name some ideology, political ideologies attached to it later on, or maybe in the 20th century or later?
Yeah, so the two philosophical streams that contribute the most to oikophobia is relativism, which I mentioned, and positivism, as I call it, which is the idea that you can achieve a perfect society. So relativism makes sense how it might contribute to oikophobia, because it doesn't say that our truth is important. There are many different truths, and our own civilization has no special claim. So that's relativism. Then we have positivism, which says that there is a higher truth, and we have to work toward it. So to work toward a utopia, for example, that's positivism. If you have to work toward a higher state, that means you have to downgrade your own civilization in order to reach that higher state. So Marxism, of course, would be an obvious example in the modern world. If you're going to achieve the end of capitalism and the rule of the proletariat, obviously that means that you have to crush your own traditions in order to achieve that state. The Frankfurt School and certain streams of French postmodernism in the 1950s and 60s, in the modern era, of course. Now, those are some other examples of this positivism. Sometimes it's relativistic, sometimes it's positivistic. But what they have in common is that they all need to downgrade their own civilization in order to achieve this higher state.
We can call it open society, openness to other cultures.
Yes.
Which is, in these days, is a positive term, right, of being open. But in your book and in your, I aware of this, that your notion is like very negative. So it's like a danger to the European societies and the European civilization or Western civilization. Why?
And this is because, well, this is part of the tragic view of history. So people tell me then when I explain this, saying, so you're against the open society since intellectuals, having a free space for intellectuals leads to this kind of a thing. I say, well, no, I'm not against the open society. I mean, I'm in favor of intellectuals, of course, being able to exchange with each other and so on. And I mean, I do this myself every day. But you have to understand that history is tragic. Something that is positive also will have a negative outcome. And this is what we, and I think this is a more conservative vision, because this is anti-utopian. I mentioned that positivism leads to utopia. We have to crush our own society in order to achieve a higher state, in order to achieve this utopia. Whereas if you have a tragic view of history, you realize that, well, yes, it's good with an open society, but sometimes there still have to be limits, because otherwise we are going to arrive at this position of oikophobia. So liberalism, this kind of liberalism where everyone can exchange and so on, is a wonderful thing. But everything in history has a bad side as well.
I understand that it's one thing that we're respecting and admire for other cultures, yeah, but the other thing is when we hate our roots and our traditions, the pillars of this societies and civilizations. One quote from Jesus, if I may. Because I found this sentence of Jesus very connected to this conversation. It's from the Evangelium, Mark chapter 3. Yeah. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house, oikos, is divided against itself, that house will collapse, says Jesus. And do you see the parallelism, what's going on here? That this kind of not just schizophrenic thing of phenomenon, but kind of a suicidal phenomenon.
And this is part of what I mentioned before, that once an external enemy has been defeated, when you have an external enemy that's about to destroy you, everyone has to rally together. And so the society then becomes more unified. But when you don't have an enemy anymore, then there is the opportunity for different groups within the society to start fighting against each other, and the house becomes divided, to use this phrase from the New Testament. And that's when oikophobia comes in, because you have to criticize all of the other parts of your society in order to raise your own individual group. So this leads to a kind of neo-tribalism, or fragmented tribalism, in which the society consists of many small tribelets, which consider each other as greater enemies than they do some foreigner.
So we were talking about now about the connection of our soul to the culture, but there's the other part of the coin that maybe the very core of the value or the tradition is not so good anymore, that people can hate them. I mean, what's wrong with the Christianity, maybe? We need to ask this question, that it doesn't connect people that strongly, that in the ancient times, in the beginning, when Jesus and apostles led to the new faith, to Europe, for example, we just lost that connection to the very root of our society and civilization. So is there any wrong with the Christianity itself?
You mean we lost the religious connection?
Because we have this kind of connection, it's our problem.
Yeah.
But is there any problem with the pillar of the society, the Christianity?
Oh, I see what you mean. So you mean the Christian pillar in and of itself? Yeah. So yes and no. So Christianity, of course, is a very complex phenomenon. There are different kinds of Christianity. So there is one type of Christianity. I mean, when it's written in the New Testament that the meek shall inherit the earth, of course, there is this idea of the weak being raised. And we see, for example, the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church in many instances has encouraged immigration to Western countries from different parts of the world which are hostile to the West. So there is one aspect of Christianity which does have this effect, which can exacerbate oikophobia. But then there's another aspect of Christianity which is the type of Christianity that I think should be more encouraged, which is a stronger type, a more muscular type of Christianity, if you will. And we see this maybe a little more in the United States. I would say the type of Christian that always carries a gun and goes to church, of course, but waves the American flag and so on. It's a different type of Christian, and that type of Christian I think is more useful in order to stave off oikophobia. Now, it is the case. Christianity in general is very important because religion is the cornerstone of every society. And so if you lose your religion, you lose everything else as well in the society. Even things that are not religious per se also collapse when religion collapses because religion undergirds everything. And so we still have to fight hard to preserve Christianity, but we should focus, I think, on this aspect of Christianity that is a little more muscular. And I know there are some people, some Christians, religious practicing Christians, who themselves have gravitated toward this more muscular type of Christianity because they themselves see that there is one type of Christianity that is this sort of weak, self-effacing, and not necessarily self-hating, but certainly self-downgrading, if you will, type of Christianity that invites elements into our society that are hostile to our traditions.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask this because the oikos of our culture, the Christian-founded civilization, Western civilization, is itself the Christianity. Yeah. So if the foundation and the most pillar of this civilization is not working very well, that causes troubles itself, not us, the man who follows the tradition or the religion. So that was the reason whether this oikophobia, the very root of the oikophobia it stems from the egoism of the modern man who doesn't care about religion, or maybe the half-lived Christianity, which lost its influence.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So, for example, I mentioned the Enlightenment before. Now, you could say that the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment in particular, is a kind of a vulgarization of Christianity. Because the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, could not have happened without Christianity because they emphasized these ideas of caring for the weak and looking after the downtrodden and so on. And those ideas are Christian ideas. And so I wouldn't say that it's so much Christianity itself that causes this problem, but rather it's a kind of a vulgarization, a vulgar type of Christianity that contributes to this problem. Now, if you look at Christianity in the very beginning, when it started in the late Roman Empire, when it was still very undeveloped, that type of Christianity is not good for society to survive because it was very pacifistic, for example, which is not good. But once Christianity became, after Constantine, once Christianity became the religion of the empire, you had a lot of Christian philosophers who realized that, okay, you can't run an empire with the idea idea of meekness and pacifism and so on. We have to be stronger because otherwise the empire can't be defended. And so the Christianity that started then, sort of toward the middle and then late 4th century AD and after that, that type of Christianity became stronger, became a more muscular Christianity. And so that is the one that needs to be preserved. A big problem of this kind of vulgar Christianity today is that it only remembers the pacifist part. It only remembers the message of the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, which is this kind of Christianity, which I would call a type of weaker type. And it forgets those Christian philosophers who worked to make it more, to make it stronger. I think you're right that Christianity can undermine, it can contribute to oikophobia and undermine our society, but we have to emphasize that aspect that does not do so.
And connecting to this, I'm just wondering that whether cultural Christianity is enough to preserve a European or Western culture civilization, or we need to dig a little bit deeper to the real Christianity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we do. There is a bit of a renaissance now in faith. I mean, if you look at the Catholic Church both in Europe and the United States, you see, for example, young Catholics now, they want to go to Latin Mass. For example, they're tired of this kind of 1960s version of Catholicism where people are sitting with a guitar in their service and so on. It's this sort of kumbaya type of service, and they want the proper traditional Latin Mass and so on. So there is a resurgence of that, which I think is a very good thing. But there are, of course, some people who will simply never believe in the literal theological aspects of Christianity. But to those people, I would at least emphasize the importance of the aesthetic value of Christianity, so that they should understand. And there is a segment of the population, certainly in the United States, which has held on to this, which is that, okay, maybe they don't believe everything that's happening in the Bible and so on, but they see the beauty of going to church, they see the beauty of a Latin Mass, and this is more true in Catholicism than in Protestantism, because Protestantism doesn't have this kind of aesthetic element to the same degree that Catholicism has, or that Orthodox Christianity has, for that matter. But so those two things together, a rise of the religion of Christianity as well as at least an embrace of the aesthetic portion of Christianity, would be helpful, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you for answering for that. And going a little bit step forward, we mentioned Christianity as one of the pillars of the Western societies and Western civilization. The other two pillars, many experts say the Greek philosophy and the Roman law. These three pillars. Is there any fourth or fifth pillars?
No, those are the ones really. The Greco-Roman pillar and the Judeo-Christian pillar. Those are the ones that we need. There is now a sort of neo-pagan movement, of course, which has, in face of collapse of Christianity, you see a certain segment of the population that is also very anti-oikophobic and that wants to preserve our own civilization, but that gravitates more toward Norse paganism or what have you, depending on where they are in the world. I don't find that so useful because it's more really a type of cosplaying in most cases. They don't really believe in Thor or Odin or what have you. And so that's more of a rebellion really than a genuine belief in something positive. So I would say those are the only pillars, yeah.
So religion, law, and philosophy, the ancient knowledge, of course, these all three. What did the ancient Europeans know better about life than us in the 20th, first century?
That the greatest thing is to have children and a big family. And because once you have children, it doesn't always happen, but most of the time, if a person has children, then they develop a desire to pass down something to their children. They suddenly have a stake in society. They want society to continue. I mean, there is the old Greek saying, who was the happiest man in the world? And they think it's going to be somebody who has a lot of money or power or something like that. But no, the answer to who the happiest man in the world is a person who had lots of children and all of his children reached adulthood, which in those days was not so obvious. And all of his grandchildren reached adulthood as well. He saw all of his grandchildren in good health and reach adulthood. That was the happiest man in the world. And so I think that is something that we really need to emphasize, which is why governments should encourage large families.
It's very important, but any connection to the old traditions in ancient times and now? Is there any difference?
Religiously, you mean?
I mean religious, philosophical, the law, and all the stuff we are talking about now.
I think that was the most important one. The reason why it was harder there was, as I mentioned, oikophobia in the ancient world as well. It didn't become quite as extreme for a few different reasons. And partly, one of them was that they had more war than we do. They did achieve a certain measure of security, but there was often some kind of war going on and not this long period of peace that we've had in the West now for a long time. So that certainly helped them in that sense. Not that I think war is a good thing, obviously, but just talking in terms of what would stop oikophobia, that is something that's important. They did also, talking about pre-Christian antiquity, one thing which is an advantage is that they didn't have this kind of sense of human rights and of the intrinsic worth of human life. Now, having a sense of the sacredness of human life can, of course, be a very useful thing for society. But if, for example, now you have all of these people fretting about, oh, what should we do about the Palestinians in Gaza and things like this, because we have a sense of the intrinsic worth of human life. The ancient Greeks and Romans didn't have this. They wouldn't care what's going on with the innocent people in Gaza or whatever. And so that also is something that if you just focus, doesn't mean that you don't care at all about what happens in the world, but it means that you know what's important is that you should focus on your own space. Other people are responsible for their societies or their areas, and we're responsible for our area. And that kind of idea, I think, is useful as well. So not to be callous or to say that human life can just be wasted easily, but not to have this kind of an idea, not this kind of universalistic ideal that we all have to care about humanity together. Because usually when we all care about humanity together, we just make things worse. That might be something that the Greeks and the Romans had that we could try to recapture a little bit, even though it's not very Christian, but it could be helpful, yeah.
Attention. Benedict, what do you think you claim in your book and you claim in your interviews that there is a definite decline of the Western civilization, and we touched in details one of the topics, the oikophobia, but can you name 2 or 3 other symptoms of the decline, which we experience now in these days?
Right. So these symptoms that I would mention have also then taken place at similar times in earlier societies, even if they're more extreme today. Probably the most obvious one is androgyny. The idea that today that we have of sexual fluidity, right? That a man can become a woman and vice versa. This kind of, again, it's more extreme today, but when a society finds itself in its oikophobic phase, it also becomes more androgynous. And traditional gender roles break down between men and women. So this is, I would say, is the most obvious sign of civilizational decadence that we see today. Another one is the idea, which is related, the idea of manliness, for example. You often hear today people say something like it's manly to be able to cry in public, for example, to be brave enough to cry, to show emotions. And I say, well, that is a sign of civilizational decadence. Doesn't mean that a man can never cry, but a man should be strong. If in an earlier phase of society, there is the attitude that, well, if a man has to cry, he does it privately. He doesn't do it in public. And the embrace of manliness as a virtue is something that is important and that we have lost, and which is a sign of civilizational decadence as well.
Thank you for summarizing that. And my last question would be about Sweden, because you were grown up in Sweden. You live in the US now, but you have a very strong experience and what you saw in your childhood, maybe in your youth in Sweden. And from Hungary, maybe from other point of view, we see Sweden as a very social democratic, very free and open society in the Scandinavian atmosphere, Swedish sphere, if I call it. But there is multiculturalism, there is migration, there is a danger of Islamic overpopulating of the society. Some street violence. We see it in big streets and big cities. How can you summarize the status of the Swedish society in this aspect, what I mentioned?
No, it's awful. I mean, I left as a child still in the 90s, went to the United States, but I've been back and visiting, and it's every time I go to Sweden to visit, it's worse than the time before. And I mean, now, for example, in the Jews exiting the synagogue on the Sabbath in Stockholm, they take off their kippah when they come out from the synagogue because they're afraid to wear it in public. Even in broad daylight, in the middle of the day, they can't wear it because they'll be...
In the big cities or everywhere?
No, well, there are only synagogues in the big cities.
I mean, some Swedish experts just explain that in the big cities it's multicultural and the countryside is very Swedish. Is it true?
That's true, but there are no synagogues in the countryside. So this particular example is only in the big cities. But that is true. I mean, as in many European countries, you notice the Islamic population is more in the cities than in the countryside. Like in France, I mean, in Paris or Brussels, they're Islamic cities. They're basically Arab cities at this point. But if you go to the countryside, you can still have a very French type of experience or Belgian experience. But so in Sweden, it has come to the point that it's a quasi-Islamic society because the left will say that, oh, well, it's only 15% or whatever it is, 10% Muslim population, what's the big deal? But obviously that minority of the population is much louder and is much aggressive than regular Swedish people. Swedish people in particular, French are a little better in this regard, but Swedish people are very non-confrontational. They hate conflict. So they stay quiet, they do their own thing, they keep their head down. So in the face of such a population, the kind of Muslim Arab population that comes in is very different from that. It's very loud, it's very aggressive. So in a country like Sweden, all you need is 20% or so, or maybe even less of the population to be Muslim, and the society becomes Muslim. So Sweden is one fairly extreme case. There are other countries as well that are moving in the same direction. I don't think that the problem can be solved in Sweden or in a number of other countries without violence, unfortunately. Again, not in favor of violence, but just as a descriptive matter, I think that's what's going to be necessary in order to solve the problem, if it will ever be solved. And I mean, this is a whole long discussion, but there are several, the left always calls us bigots, of course, when we talk about Islam. The point is, and this is something I've written about as well, there are very concrete philosophical reasons that you can explain, that I have explained, why Islam does not belong in the West and why it is, and not Islamism. Conservatives have to stop saying Islamism because they make it sound like Islam is okay and there is Islamism, which is not okay. But no, mainstream Islam does not belong in the West. And there are very serious, concrete philosophical reasons that can be offered for this. And
you say this because you are a Christian and you have some knowledge about the Quran.
I'm actually not a Christian. I'm actually Jewish. Yeah, I was raised
Jewish.
Yes.
I didn't know that, Benedict.
I was raised Jewish.
I changed the question. This is because you are Jewish. You say this, or
no?
It's objective.
It's because I'm a philosopher, and
the
philosophy of religion is one of my areas of expertise. Political philosophy, the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of history and aesthetics, and ancient Greek philosophy. I think those are my main areas of expertise. And so I write about the philosophies, not just Islam, I write about Christianity, I write about Judaism, different things. But if you compare Islam, I had a long article that was published a couple of years ago that explained three main philosophical reasons why Islam does not belong in the West, comparing it with Christianity and Judaism. And so that's why I say that, because you can really show why this is the reason. Yeah.
Benedict, would you live in Sweden again?
No, never.
And can you tell shortly the reason?
Well, I feel American. I mean, I was still a child when I came to the United States, so I was Americanized. I feel more American, but also I feel much freer in the United States. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's still the freest country in the world. We have great opportunity there, and it's just, you can speak much more freely. Now, of course, there are particular places in the United States where they still, where the left tries to suppress speech. That happens, of course, everywhere. But by and large, in the country as a whole, it's still a freer country than in Sweden, where the mentality is much more narrow. Yeah.
I understand. Benedict, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for the attention. Bye-bye. See you next week.